And so I hadn't taken Luigi's class, and I read his book, and had been listening to his podcast. So I was very interested in this question of markets and how they function and when they don't function. And yes, there's a plug for the podcast. It's really great. You should all listen to it. And there's some material on the table out there, I think, on that. And so Luigi was coming into town, and I thought we kind of thought, okay, what's a great conversation to have that Luigi can help bring about here? And it was about big tech and markets and competition. And so with that in mind, I asked Hannah if she'd be willing to make that conversation happen, because she covers big tech, in particular Facebook, and the impact on society. And so I commend her for her work in helping us save democracy right now.
It's a tall order.
It's no small task. And then I was trying to think, okay, who's someone who's actually gone up against a giant and built a business out of it, despite all the difficulties that the giant, Google, for those, to name it. Who's done that before? And Jeremy came to mind. And this is where I think I'll take it back to the Nobel Prize winning Eugene Farmer, who I think coined the term random walk. It was fairly random, so I thought, okay, if I email Jeremy, he doesn't know me, he's probably going to get lost in his inbox. So I emailed someone who had the connection with at Yelp and said, hey, we'd love to invite Jeremy to this event. His response was, he talked to some people who know Jeremy, and Jeremy would never do something like that. So I was a bit dejected, but a few days later I woke up and I thought, no one actually asked Jeremy. So I decided to email Jeremy directly, and he said yes. He responded. So that was a very very fortunate event. And something else which is a bit random or coincidental. So Hannah very kindly wrote about my startup GoodRipple in the Financial Times some time back, and in that same paragraph, Yelp is also mentioned, because we were both companies that at least Yelp puts into practice. You really value kindness at work, and there's a culture of kindness at work, and we're trying to bring that to other companies. So it's kind of very, very accidental in a good way, kind of random for this to happen. So that's a little bit of the story. So I'll start introducing the panel. We have Hannah Kuchler. So we both are alumni of another school, Balliol College, Oxford, which is also the alma mater of Adam Smith, so very, very topical for this conversation. So she writes about big tech and cybersecurity, and as I said, really trying to save democracy right now. So, Jeremy is the founder and CEO of Yelp, and he has been a lone but very powerful voice in this conversation about what's happening, what can happen when big tech companies try to snuff out competition, and Yelp is a great example of a company that has stood up and is standing up to that. He's also part of PayPal Mafia, the so-called PayPal Mafia. So I've read on Wikipedia. So I want this to be addressed today as to whether this is a good thing for markets. So I think he's probably going to have two hats.
Mafias are always good for
That's
markets,
some negative
right?
branding right there. It sounded cute 10 years ago.
And most of you will have known or come across Luigi. Most of you are GoodRipple alums here. So he's a phenomenal professor. Even though I didn't take his class, I've been really influenced by his writing and research. And really, I think he's been called, for one of the books, the most robust defense of the markets, maybe since Milton Friedman. So at least there's a big legacy to carry on here about the power of the markets and when it could work and when it doesn't work. And he's got numerous awards and published in all the major papers, including science papers, which I understand. And if you didn't know, maybe more importantly, he was voted the sexiest economist in 2009 at the Festival of Economics in Trento, Italy.
He's the tallest midget.
And that was quantified. So they looked at how many women asked the economists, including you and Nouriel Roubini and some others, for autographs, and you came out first. So
I would like to object. Maybe women aren't asking for autographs because they think someone's sexy.
that is completely fair. He's reporting what the Italian press reported. So with that, I'm very excited to hear this conversation, and thank you again for making this happen.
That is a fantastic list of achievements, and Luigi actually said to me that really he didn't want any of them mentioned. All he wanted was for people to know that his podcast is available in card form, which I've assured him is a massive security risk because you're meant to put it in your community. But you can get it on iTunes as well. Capitalism. There we are. So thank you both so much for joining me. As Rama mentioned, I spend far too much of my life covering Facebook. Apparently, at one point, I was meant to be saving democracy, but it feels much more like just writing about Facebook. So Jeremy, I wanted to talk to you about how, while the focus has been so much on whether Facebook needs more regulation, we've had Congress even talking about whether it's, too big to regulate. Why is no one talking about Google?
That's an excellent question. I would probably say because Google has been playing this game for a very long time. When it comes to lobbying, when it comes to PR, and dealing with these tricky issues, especially around antitrust and around privacy. I would challenge anyone to try and find a lobbyist, for instance, in DC that is not connected to Google in some way. We've tried, actually, at Yelp. Eventually you find one, but it might not be your first choice. Apologies out there to our lobbyist friends. But they play a very savvy game, both GR and media. And so I think that is part of the story, because you can't have a very honest discussion about privacy on the internet without talking about Google. They have probably the most data on humans of any company on the planet. You don't worry too much about the dog photo or the child photo you posted on Facebook, but that search query that maybe you did at 2 a.m., you might be a little bit more worried about who has that, who knows that information, and why am I seeing these weird ads as I travel across the internet. So I would chalk it up to Google's incredible PR and GR savvy.
And I want to get into that because you have some really interesting anecdotes about how they've behaved and how they've kind of constructed the sort of universe of thought around these issues. But first of all, what is your problem with Google?
We have a very long history. So we started the company back in 2004, and by 2005 things were starting to work, and that was Google's heyday. They were convincing us that they were just a turnstile, and they were often saying it. They were making fun of sites like Yahoo that tried to provide everything for users and be a portal and a destination that locked you in. They said, we really have no interest in being the web. We just want to organize the world's information and send people on to the very best content possible. And we really took that to heart. We wanted to be the best destination for consumer information and consumer reviews about local businesses. And we wanted to be completely white hat about it. We've never been web spammers. We've never broken any of Google's search algorithm rules or SEO rules. And so initially it was actually a nice collaboration in the sense that they weren't very focused on our space in 2005. They started driving us some traffic, which brought in more users, which brought in more content, which got us more traffic from Google. So they were really the way that we were distributed through the internet, the way that we were growing. Over time, they became more interested in the local space, and I would say they became more interested in the threat of vertical players. So in hotels, you might have TripAdvisor. In local search, you might have Yelp. In shopping, there might be comparison shopping sites, et cetera. And so it's been now well documented that internally within Google, in documents that leaked from the FTC and the Wall Street Journal, internally they were having this discussion around, hey, this is a real competitive threat. We need to respond to vertical search, and we need to put some resources against it. And so they started working to build an internal property that was a lot like Yelp. But their initial take was, hey, we're going to incorporate content from around the web. We're going to kind of try to stick initially to our organizing principles. And so we licensed them content. We actually signed an agreement with Google, as did a lot of other providers.
You regret that now?
Well, there's more to this. That was the beginning. So that was early on. We signed an agreement to license portions of our content. And over time, we saw that the thing that they were building looked more and more exactly like what we provided. And so we communicated very clearly. We said, hey, we're fine with you somewhat competing. It's sort of borderline what you're doing. We can kind of see how the product is starting to look more like ours. But where we draw the line is if you start collecting your own content, if you're competing with us, you're using our reviews to collect reviews, that's it. And so I think it was around 2007, they finally called us up and they're like, well, we have some bad news. We're going to start collecting reviews, but we still really want you to keep giving us your content so that we can backfill and eventually get rid of you. And so we thought we wouldn't take that deal, and thus began essentially the war, the long war.
So we're on year 11 then?
Well, from 2007 to now, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't think I had any gray hair. So that's where we kind of went our separate ways, and we somewhat competed in our own lanes for a little bit. But then they actually got frustrated, and they got sloppy. And they decided, well, we don't have this Yelp content, and we're not really succeeding at building all this content and all these other long tail categories. So why don't we just steal it? And so that's what they did. Even though they no longer had an agreement, we had canceled it. Our content was not in their local property. All of a sudden, they started using our content, which they were crawling, of course, for their generalized web search, and they sucked in our reviews and put it into their directly competing.
So this is the local box that you see when
you... The local box, yeah. Search. And so they started filling it out once again with Yelp reviews while collecting content on top of it. Exactly the thing that they initially realized we wouldn't go for, and of course we weren't happy about. And so all through this period, whenever they were doing things like that, we were kind of shaming them in the press, and sometimes they would react and make accommodations or changes, and eventually that stopped working. And so now it was about 2009 that things were really coming to a head, and by the end of 2009 they actually made an offer to buy the company. And so we contemplated that. But
how much for?
I think it was about $550 million. And so it's always a tough decision, staring down serious money, but we decided to go our separate ways and pursue the IPO path and raise money, and so then we continued to do our best to compete. And of course, by then the iPhone had launched, Android was kind of in its infancy, and the game continued to change. And so they launched the Android platform, and the Android phones came out, and it initially had no Yelp-like application on it. It had Google Maps, but it didn't really have a direct competitor to Yelp. And then one day, it was probably, I think, in 2010 or so, everybody who had an Android phone suddenly had a Google Places app on it that was very much like Yelp. And even better, soon after, our content reappeared, completely stolen, with no attribution. And then we fought over that, and eventually they took it out. So it's been this back and forth cat and mouse sort of game. And eventually, we stopped having success in dealing with Google through the press, and we started talking with regulators. We gave a presentation at one point at an Attorneys General conference, and that kind of got the ball rolling with us being a relatively sizable company that people knew about that would actually be willing to talk on the record about Google. And that's kind of how you find me here today.
And so have you ever tried to quantify how much it has affected your business?
It's very hard to say, other than obviously it's affected it a lot. If you go on your phone right now and you search for something in a search box, it inevitably will be a Google search box. And then you will literally have to thumb down to try and even find web results anymore. And so they've taken this trust that they built in the kind of mid-2000s with all of us, as sending us to the best content on the web, and they've taken advantage of that in specific verticals, where we're all kind of asleep at the wheel. We go to Google, it's convenient, it's the default, and the information that they surface we feel like is probably the best. But what if you search for physician because your child is sick and you just don't even notice that they've buried the web results and there's consumer reviews, really valuable ones that you didn't even know existed because Google decided to optimize search for itself.
So what do you think that Larry and Sergey back then when they started, what do you think they would think of the way that Google's behaving now?
I mean, they would laugh at modern day Google. And it's well documented because this existed in a sense before with AOL and Yahoo, where they were destinations. People started, and that was the place that they started to get access to the internet, but they tried to provide all of these services, some of which were pretty good and some of which were not so good, and they really wanted to trap the user as much as possible to monetize that user as much as possible. And so when Larry and Sergey started, they were like, those things are terrible. We don't want that. We would never do that. We're a turnstile. We'll send you to the best place on the web. And frankly, the philosophy of Google has just fundamentally changed.
So Luigi, obviously I can see why, Jeremy wants to fight back against big tech. Why should people that don't have, businesses that directly compete care that there is so little competition?
So I think that competition has a lot of positive effects on many dimensions, including innovation. So most people think, or they are influenced by the late Schumpeter, who claims that having some monopoly power helps increase the amount of innovation you do. But in reality, if you look at history, the big spurt of innovation, especially in the United States, took place around the time in which the antitrust intervened and actually forced more competition in the sector. So when the AT&T invented the transistors, they were still a public regulated utility. And so they intervened. It was not the antitrust there, but was more concerned of to force AT&T to license the transistor to everybody. And that is basically what spurred innovation in the United States at the time. Then, of course, when they broke up AT&T, that's when the mobile revolution took place. It was thanks to the antitrust going after IBM that we had the PC revolution. And the reason why we have Google and Facebook today is because in '98, they went after Microsoft. And those of you who are a little bit older, like me, remember the time where this took place. And remember the time where there was a Lotus 123 before Excel, and actually it was working better. There was a word processor called WordPerfect before Word, and actually worked better. There was a email system called Eudora that worked much better than Outlook. And all this stuff has been completely destroyed by Microsoft. Why? Abusing its dominant position. And funnily enough, there is a paper in the Journal of Financial Economics that actually I used to assign to my students to test whether they understood something of the course or not, where they look at the antitrust case against Microsoft and show that every time the antitrust was making a step in more aggressive with Microsoft, the tech sector, excluding Microsoft, was going down. And every time they were compromising, etc., was going up. And the paper concludes, in my way completely erroneously, that the attack to Microsoft was a reduction of welfare, etc. And this paper is wrong in two ways. First of all, because the purpose of antitrust is not to maximize stock prices, it's to maximize welfare, which is not measured by the stock price. And I'm not saying it's inversely related, but it's sort of clearly not always positively related. But the most important thing that people don't understand, and so that was the minimum for passing grade, that you at least got that point. The more sophisticated point is this. All the technology that was out there in that moment was Microsoft dependent. So obviously, if Microsoft was losing, they were losing as well. But the purpose of Microsoft was to help the new generation of startups that were not traded at the time, and so you don't see them, but that's where the new innovation come along. And I think that we will not have had Google and Facebook if not for that particular antitrust case. And so now is the time to start thinking about what are the businesses that we're losing as a result of dominant position of some giants. And as I mentioned earlier to you personally, I don't like to club them all together because they're different, and probably the remedies are different. What is common is in the United States, unlike Europe, in the United States, monopoly per se is not a problem if you acquire it through organic growth. So the fact that Google dominates the search market is because they've been the best search is not a problem per se. What is the problem is that they use this power to leverage another sector, and the case of Yelp is it. So it's not that I like Jeremy or I like particular Yelp.
Why not?
No, I
What's
don't
wrong
like
with
it.
me?
I don't dislike you, I don't like you. I'm just saying this is a neutral statement. I'm concerned about the use that Google does in the searches to distort competition in sectors in which they're present. And they are becoming more and more basically the channel to which people search and go in the internet. And I think that they should remain an independent channel, not with an interest in what they're selling along the way, because that will distort competition.
So let's talk about what it's like to be a startup, maybe quite a bit smaller than Yelp. Today, you have the competition element, the direct competition element. You also, it seems, find it quite difficult to disconnect yourself from actually giving a lot of your money to some of the big tech companies. I mean, Snap, I think last year gave half of its revenue to Google for Google Cloud and Amazon for Amazon Web Services. You have people spending huge amounts of money to on app install ads through Facebook. And I think, you were mentioning to me earlier, there's also the whole investment sphere. Google now has, did you say 5 venture capital firms?
Something like that.
So how is there a way of living your life as a startup and growing without contacting these companies?
I think it is pretty scary, especially because you often find yourself relying on these, as you said, channels like Facebook for distribution. And of course, these big companies are extremely savvy and are monitoring in real time what startups are breaking out, what startups are being searched for, what startups are reaching consumers. And I think we had, it was a small story. It kind of came and went in the news of a tiny little, relatively small startup that Facebook acquired, sub $100 million. And so it was really promising. It was growing fast. And
this is TBH.
TBH.
It's like a teen social app.
Yeah, and it disappeared out of the market before we ever got to see what its possibilities were. Was that going to be, the next Facebook competitor? Is it led by the next Mark Zuckerberg? Like, we'll never know because it was taken out because Facebook saw data that made it concerned and made it act. And so I think that's pretty challenging. And then you do have, the power of these big companies in the form of venture capital. Like, that is a very real and scary force, which is if I have a board member that is a Google Ventures person, am I going to really talk about my problems with Google? I literally do know companies that have this specific issue of they have a Google issue, they come and they talk to me about it, but they actually are not going to be sitting in this chair talking to you all because they're funded partially by Google. And so I think that is a pretty pernicious thing. You also see it actually in board members. Google, often lets its executives sit, even if there isn't an investment, sit on the role of other companies in the local space, in our particular sector. And I think that's a little bit creepy to have executives starting to be, essentially monitors of all the different companies in the space. So, there's lots of subtle ways that these large technology companies have a grip on Silicon Valley and have a very real effect on innovation. You also think about, the ad market in particular. It is awfully difficult to be a new company that goes to venture capital right now and says, I'm going to make money by selling ads to consumers. Like, that is a terrifying proposition to hear as a venture capital. There is pretty much no way that you are going to make that investment in this environment. Why? Because if I'm looking for advertising, I basically have 2 real stops to go to. I go to Facebook and I go to Google. And then maybe there's like 1 or 2 that I consider, if I'm a local business, maybe I consider Yelp as part of that. But there are very few companies on the list that even get minor consideration because these 2 companies have so much power in distribution and ability to reach consumers.
Yeah. And Luigi, you seem to say that this could be basically a problem for the whole economy. But are there any particular areas that you've noticed that there's a real paucity of startups?
I think that he's right that in some sector of social media, people don't start a company anymore, and we have seen in several sectors actually a reduction in VC. Now, it's hard to tell whether this reduction is because of the lack of exit strategy or the fear of competition, but certainly we have seen a reduction. And as a VC, I would never invest in any of this activity. It would be crazy. It's too much of a risk.
Yeah, yeah. And so when it comes to M&A, I mean, do you think that there is a problem with, I mean, you mentioned TBH, and in fact, before that you said they could tell by the data that TBH was becoming popular. One of the reasons Facebook can tell is they actually acquired another company called Anovo a few years back, which is actually it's actually a VPN.
Fake VPNs, basically.
So but to be a VPN, it has to be able to see all your traffic going in and out of your phone, and therefore it knows which apps are suddenly becoming popular. And so it was far more useful for Facebook for that. But so do you think that there should be a new way of considering M&A?
I mean, the FTC could be, which is in the U.S. responsible for most of antitrust enforcement. I guess occasionally DOJ. I'm not sure how they divvy up, but they
They're
could.
Not sure either.
Yeah, there's always a discussion when a topic arises in that area, but they could be more active in investigating possible mergers. I think there is a sub $100 million rule, but I don't think it's a firm rule. I think it's just sort of a consistent policy that if a large company acquires something below that threshold, they tend to not take a deeper look at it. But if I'm, a FTC commissioner, maybe I'm interested in getting more assertive at this point when you see sort of the power and impact of these very large media companies masquerading as tech companies.
But not only you could be more assertive in future merger, but there is a question of saying, can we go back and say, was a mistake to have Facebook buy Instagram or have Facebook buy WhatsApp? And why not to break them up? I think that if we do think that Facebook has too much of a power, one way to address it is to break up. After, I don't know how many people know, but the University of Chicago was founded by Rockefeller, who was the first one who was a victim of that breakup. Actually claims he made money even in the breakup. But the point is that it's not unprecedented in any form or shape to have a breakup. AT&T benefit tremendously from a breakup, and especially given that these are relatively recent mergers, and the European authorities say that Facebook even lie because they say
they got their biggest fine ever on WhatsApp.
Yeah. So why don't you go a bit more aggressive? Because fines, actually, a question arose, where do those fines go? Who enjoys those fines? So it's not obvious that they fix the problem, especially they don't fix the problem of Yelp and the problem of competition in general. So I think having more structural remedies is important. And I think that there is an increasing mistrust our behavioral remedies, because once you have a behavioral remedy, you have basically a competition among lawyers, so now you can massage things and let them slip along the way. And sometimes being more assertive and cleaner is better, and breakup is very clean. And especially companies that have recently merged, I don't see the technical problem of undoing them, and that can create enormously more competition.
Mm. Yeah, it's curious where the fines go to. Maybe they should be using them to create a European VC industry.
I wouldn't recommend that, because I think getting the states involved in VC. My favorite line is, in Italy, the government is not even, the state is not even able to do the basic stuff like delivering the mail on time or stuff. Do you really want to do that, VC? No. And I think applies to...
There are a lot of VCs I wouldn't trust to deliver the mail on time either, but it could certainly lead to accusations of protectionism. So one of the big ideas in antitrust at the moment is whether we should be considering data rather than price. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you think that there is a way of taking into account the value of data in antitrust?
Of course, it should be considered. Actually, last year, I had a privilege and the fun to interview Judge Posner, who, for those of you who don't know, he just stepped down as judgeship in September, October. but he was the biggest scholar in antitrust in Chicago. And I asked him about Google, and not only said that he had no problem with Google, he said that when he has to make judicial decision, he actually Googled stuff to get information. So that made me even more worried about the ranking of Google, because now even not only Yelp is affected, even the judgment against you might be affected. So I think that there is an attitude that because Google is free, or at least appears as free, then there is no problem for consumer. Now, first of all, we need to understand that these places are two-sided platforms, and so two-sided platforms have a different kind of economics, and you subsidize one side and charge the other, but you have to look that in the complex. So if Facebook and Google basically divide the online market for ads, which is pretty much correct, sorry for your help, but they do.
We got a little slice, a little cheese.
Then they might have excessive power in that dimension, and so even if they sell their stuff for free, it's still a problem. Second, I don't think that is actually a free exchange, because you are giving up something that you maybe not understand how valuable it is, but is very valuable, which are your data. And in fact, now there are a lot of different movements of trying to change this attitude. So the son of Dick Posner has a book that is coming out now called Radical Markets, where he thinks that we should create markets for data where people are paid for the data they give to, but that somehow should be regulated, because most of us click yes without realizing and what we're giving up. So that's one approach. Another approach is to have the government more involved somehow in protecting you. That's kind of the European approach. The third approach, which is the one I prefer, is to make this data more portable, make it easier for competitors to come in. So you all give for granted, for example, that your phone number is portable if you change phone company, okay? This was not the case at the beginning. This is the result of government regulation, and actually good government regulation. I don't even like to call it regulation. It's redefinition of property rights in a way that makes things more efficient. So it's not that a company spends a huge amount of money investing in creating a phone number. It's just by default that belongs to the company. If you change by law who this belongs to, you change competition. And actually, I have a paper documenting that countries that introduce number portability have lower prices for cell phone services and no lower quality. In fact, if anything, a bit higher quality, but certainly no lower quality. So it seems that this is a net gain. And so the question is, okay, the number is portable. What about your bank account number? Have you ever tried to move your bank account from Citigroup to Bank of America? It's a nightmare, because you have a credit card, you have your check, you have a salary that is credited there, you have a bunch of links, and the risk is such that you don't move it. And when you don't move it, there's no competition. Why I can call Verizon and say, I want my AT&T number transfer, and they do it in 2 hours, and I cannot call Bank of America and do the same.
Yeah.
And actually, this is not science fiction, because in Europe, this is law as of January of 2018. Now, whether there is implementable, etc., is not that obvious, but they are trying to have a common API where you can tell another bank, I want all my information transferred to you. And this is not only fantastic to compete on what is the best bank account, but also your banker has some privileged information about your spending habits and your regularity in getting checks, all the stuff. This is extremely useful in, for example, giving you a loan in case you need it. But because they're a monopoly, they behave like monopolists in this, and they overcharge you. Yeah. And they overcharge you for the data you gave to them. That's kind of the irony. And if with data portability, you can give to competitors the same set of data, so they compete for your services, and it's better services. Now, the same is true for Facebook. So I don't know if you know, but if I give to her my login and password on Facebook, she goes on Facebook and get information with my permission from Facebook, she commits a crime. She can go to jail for hacking on this. Now, who enforces this law very aggressively? Is because Facebook wants to prevent that. There was a little startup called Power Ventures that was doing exactly that, was consolidating your information across multiple platforms. That's called multi-homing in the world of a two-sided platform. Multi-homing favors competition. Facebook did everything they could to sort of block that, and they've been successful so far. So I think that there are many ways to try to increase competition, and the great thing about technology, and especially in this place, is that once you give an opportunity, they catch it fast. Today, I was speaking with an alum at Palo Alto who started a company to basically bypass the credit cards that they harass you by overcharge you for late fees and stuff like that. And he plans payment across credit cards, so to make sure that you're never late. and if you carry a balance, instead of paying an arm and a leg and 19%, they charge you like your credit probably risk-weighted thing that is 5 or 6%. And all this is thanks to technology. So I think that the moment you facilitate access, facilitate data portability, competition will benefit consumers tremendously.
So GDPR in Europe is actually requiring a level of data portability. Do you think that's enough?
Actually, I will distinguish. GDPR is mostly about privacy.
Yes.
And what is called free banking or open banking is more that actually got in a little bit earlier, is about data portability. So the open banking remains to be seen how much the banks are sandbagging this initiative, because I'm not a technical guy. You probably correct me if I'm wrong, but it's all an issue of how easy you make to connect through the API. And because the banks don't have an interest, they're gonna drag their feet as much as possible. Is a bit like in the mobile industry, when you have the unbundling, there is somebody that has to facilitate this. If you have no interest in doing that, you drag your feet, you make it extremely difficult. And for a newcomer, this is painful. So we'll see how effective this is going to be, but I think it's clearly in the right direction. And we've not touched the other big elephant in the room, which is, of course, privacy. And in Europe, especially in Germany, for obvious reasons, they're more sensitive to the privacy than the United States. But I'd say we have to be very sensitive too. I think that the big brothers is around the corner, if not already present. And I think we need to realize what to do about it.
Yeah. Jeremy, would you be happy if I could take all my data from Yelp and take it someone else?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, let's give you an easier question. Is there something that you would like people to be able to bring to Yelp from another site?
I mean, we actually do get some amount of data, or you can bring in your data from Facebook, like your profile photo, and we're able to spot if there's already friends of yours in the Yelp network and connect them to you automatically. So there is some portability, but Facebook is quite careful to make sure that it's not the good stuff, that you can't recreate Facebook just by users bringing all of their content directly.
And sorry, and the other point that's important, people underestimate, is even when they let you do that, it's still that they can take it away at any moment.
Yeah.
So they let you do it until you're not a threat, and when you are a threat, they take it away. So if I want to invest in a competitor of Facebook, no chance I'm going to do it, because I know that the moment I succeed, they're going to shut me down.
Yeah. I mean, the other interesting thing around the Facebook history is that they became successful and grew so quickly by pulling on other data from other companies that was portable. And so the history there is...
No, precisely because they know it. They've done it. They know it. They don't,
yeah, of course, they closed the door. So like it started with, you may remember, for those that were early on the Facebook platform, they pushed you heavily to scan your contacts with whatever email provider, and then they sent out invites, please, join my friend network on Facebook. And those were, even though it was actually, it was a little bit clunky, and the way that Facebook and other companies at the time did it was clunky, it worked, and the email companies actually looked the other way, surprisingly.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as Facebook became very successful, they knew to shut that door behind them. And there was, I think, a famous situation where there was like some battle between Facebook and Orkut that was happening in Latin America. And I think it was Facebook figured out a way to drive its users through Orkut, which was the most popular social network at the time in Brazil. And then Google was the one to shut the door on them. So everybody plays that game.
But it's actually famous. Intel was created by two people who left Fairchild Semiconductor, basically taking away the technology from Fairchild Semiconductor and made a fortune with Intel. And Intel is one of the firms who is most aggressive in suing any employee who starts their own firm. So they learn.
Baked into the culture now. Yeah.
So we've spoken about, data and network effects and how you can try and tackle those, and then the most obvious way of breaking up companies and making, destroying monopolies is M&A. But what about features? This is something that again has come up with Facebook recently. Is it legitimate to say, well, stories, which was on Snapchat, is just a 24-hour load of photos that go past. What's so special about that? Why can't I import that into my app? Is that okay? Because we know that really did damage Snapchat.
I think, copying features is something that we've all done in Silicon Valley. Like innovation in general, you're building on the shoulder of giants. So, show me something innovative, and I could show you probably two things that were the precursor, and their innovation was connecting those two things. In our case, consumer reviews existed before Yelp, and then social networks was born before Yelp, and our insight was kind of marrying the two together. So I think you go down a very weird path if you say, oh, well, copying something that is working for another company is a terrible idea. I think it's acceptable. I think, where it becomes a real problem is if you have a monopoly that is dominating the space, and then they copy something and then close off the distribution opportunity that maybe existed there before. Like in our case, with Google, I think it's fine for them to try and build their own version of Yelp, but to the extent that they muck with their monopoly in general search and start pushing down the best information for the benefit of their crappier product, that is essentially smothering innovation in the crib.
So just so you know, I'm going to open up to questions in about 10 minutes, so get thinking. But now I'd like to move on to a section I'd like to call Advise a Regulator. What would you, how would you advise regulators, and in particular on the issue of moving fast enough in this, right? We were talking about Microsoft earlier. To actually take action against Microsoft took a really long time.
It did. There is a saying, the remedy is the trial. And so if you do have effective, assertive antitrust enforcement, even if it's not super fast, it can still create oxygen for innovation. And earlier, we heard from Luigi that 1998 was kind of the peak of the Microsoft trial. So guess what year Google was born? 1998. Coincidence? I don't think so. And so, even if we don't get all of our ducks in a row super fast, I still think that scrutiny and assertive enforcement can make a difference. It causes, these large, very powerful companies to think twice about doing, essentially abusing their power. And it's not necessarily going to stop them in their tracks, but I think we still have to press forward. And of course, would I like regulators to move faster? Absolutely. I think it's been frustrating, particularly in Europe, where I think they were way ahead of the curve, both on antitrust and on privacy. But it has taken a very long time. And I do think fundamentally that is one of the challenges of antitrust enforcement in tech, is that the innovation cycle is really fast, the technology is moving really fast, and government, democratic governance in general, moves quite slowly. And so that is the biggest challenge. And I think the short-term remedy is, well, let's at least look at the problem, let's expose what we can expose, let's get to the documents, let's have the trials, let's have assertive enforcement, and then we'll worry about the rules once we get to that place. But we're not even fully there yet.
Let me try something slightly different. I think that the problem, in my view, is lack of political will. Because it's not like the FTC did not look at Google. They did look at Google. And as we know, the Wall Street Journal leaked out a memo in which the research department actually found a lot of problems with Google.
Yep.
But the commissioners voted like 5-0 to shelve the case. And I think the question is, why did they do it? And what can we do differently? Because I don't think that we lack instruments. I don't think we lack technical expertise. I think that with a little bit of effort, you find evidence. So the only thing that is lacking is political will.
Yeah, and there's an important book written on this subject that I recently discovered called The Chicken Shit Club.
Yeah.
Jesse
Eisinger, yeah.
Yeah, and it talks
Great
about,
title.
it's really focused on the U.S. and how we lost our will to prosecute and to take on tough cases. And, that applies in all areas of business, including antitrust. And I think, post Enron, now Enron was sort of the last time that we held, a company to task. After that, it really
By the way, you know
softened.
who went after Enron?
Was it Comey or the other guy?
Mueller.
Yeah. All right, this is getting stressful.
No, just to give you a sense of how tough the guy was, the way he got at the top of Enron, he started to go out after Andrew Faster, and Andrew Faster was not willing to cooperate. So he found some problem in the tax return that will involve also his wife. So at some point there was a threat that both husband and wife will go to jail with small kids, and the kid had to put in foster care. And at that point, Andrew Faster caved in, and they negotiated a plea bargain in which he will do some jail, but not at the same time as his wife, so the kids will be protected. And then that allowed him to go. So the guy
that's
is
actually
an
a positive
SOB.
story. Okay, great.
But
I feel
he does
bad.
his job very
You
well.
wanted some positivity as part of this panel, so Mueller's
That
tough.
wasn't me.
All right, we got a guy.
That's the reason why, when he was appointed, Trump was so mad, because he knows the guy.
I see. So there's another part of the story when it comes to the FTC, which is, I went in there and I actually spoke to all the commissioners around 2011, and literally one after the other was parroting lines that I had heard publicly from Google, government relations, and PR. And so, my takeaway was, wow, Google was way ahead of us in even realizing that they were going to be under antitrust scrutiny. They've been here for a very long time. And then I thought about it a little further, and I'm like, well, Google's led by, at the time, Eric Schmidt. Where was Eric Schmidt in 1998? He was CEO of Novell, basically in my seat, talking smack about Microsoft. And so he saw the entire playbook from the other side, and so when he ended up in the driver's seat at Google, realized market share is taking off, he clearly put into place a very smart playbook on how do you deal with that better than Microsoft.
And also, I think his own, Eric Schmidt has a private company on the side that helped tremendously Obama being reelected. And surprise, surprise, the case against Google was dropped immediately after the re-election of Obama.
Yeah, well, the Obama administration was terrible on antitrust. In fact, Obama himself parroted some of Google's lines about, the Europeans are just being protectionist. They don't like our technology leaders, et cetera, et cetera. So that's true. And then also on healthcare.gov, when it fell over, sort of Obama's marquee project, with Obamacare, and that's the site that you would go and sign up. And at launch date, it was a complete disaster. They'd spent hundreds, I think $600 million or something building this awful site. It was Google people that rushed in, I think former Google people, but rushed in and fixed it all up and made it work, several months later.
So before we open up to questions, what would you say would be the one thing that you hope that regulators, and they may be here, they may be in Europe, they may be some of the states are obviously getting much more interested in the power of big tech companies. What's the one thing you would like them to do?
Domestically here in the U.S., let's get the case going. Let's get some scrutiny. Congress could take another look at antitrust with big technology companies, particularly Google. There's no reason, especially in the wake of the leaked FTC documents. I think that opens up a lot of questions that are unanswered. I think also with the Android platform and mobile, they've never looked at it. They just looked at web search, which was desktop web search in 2011. So let's reopen the file. Let's take a neutral look at it and see what we find. And the state AGs can play a role too. Missouri AG actually just filed a case several months ago. And so they can, similarly pursue, just the facts and the information, and then let, the public decide.
Luigi, do you have one ask?
Actually, to be more aggressive, I think that there is, as I said, lack of political will, and it's interesting because during the campaign, Trump at least made some noises about being more serious about antitrust, a bit to differentiate himself from Hillary, but so far we have not seen very much except against basically CNN or in the merger. But so people claim that this is politically motivated. I think that would be an interesting thing to change this. And the positive signal is a clinical faculty of Chicago look at the history of political platforms among Republicans and Democrats of the last 100 and something years. And they actually wrote in the pro-market blog. And the word antitrust disappeared from the platforms from the late 70s to today, and now has resurfaced. And I think that's a sign that something is changing. And in Washington, things take longer than you would like to, but I think eventually there will be a change.
Oh, so you did get a positive note. Excellent. So I'm going to open up to questions. I'm going to repeat your questions because we don't have a roving mic, but I am mic'd up and we have a video going. So say them loud enough for me to hear. Yeah, in the front row.
So I have a question on your views on Amazon, which I think is a very different beast. It doesn't necessarily enjoy monopoly power in any particular sector, but it appears right now if Amazon decides to go into a sector that is this thing of death by Amazon, they enjoy enviable sort of trust from consumers as well as capital that's been extremely patient. Should that also be a worry for companies, and how would you regulate?
So that's a really important question which we didn't touch upon at all, which is how, is Amazon a threat to companies and how do you regulate it?
So first of all, as you said, Amazon is a lot of things. You have the cloud services, you have the marketplace, you have all those things. You should treat them differently because the cloud services, they are in competition with Google, Microsoft, etc. So I don't think that they have a position that is too dominant as we expect. I think that the marketplace is what worries me the most, not now, but prospectively, because now they have, 70% or 80% of online retail, but that's only 20% of total retail or whatever. So I think that it's hard to make a case that they have so much market power. However, this is increasing progressively, and in particular, they've been very good to consumers. I think we all benefited tremendously from their services. I'm more concerned about their monopoly power on the other side, and paradoxically, in one place would be on labor. We know that they pay people very little, and when they become the only game in town, or the main game in town, they might have a lot of monopoly power, and that is something that antitrust is supposed to take care, but there is very little appetite. When you ask the antitrust people, they always quote you one case of chicken and chicken producers and etc., which I'm not trying to dismiss, it's very important, etc., but it doesn't seem to at the cutting edge of technology. And I think that the problem is a problem becoming bigger. So you probably remember, because it involved the Silicon Valley, that there was a no poaching agreement between Google and Apple and etc. that cost all engineers around here at least $2 billion. The case was settled for $400 million with smoking gun emails. And this is, I actually read to my class the email between Eric Schmidt and Steve Jobs, and it's a lot of fun. It's sort of it's a lot of fun to read them, but when you think about the content, it's not funny at all. And so what I say is that if in the worst case scenario, when you're caught with your pants down, you pay, a fifth or a sixth of what you save, then that's an incentive to poach more, to collude more. I think that, so I think that we need to be much more proactive in that, even if in the moment, I don't see the immediate and present danger, number one. And number two, we have to be careful because there is a part of the political spectrum that say, oh, we should protect everybody. So we should block Amazon because Amazon is putting out of business the grocery store on the corner. And I have all due respect of the grocery store on the corner, but if you are much more efficient, at some point, we know the businesses have to die, because otherwise we'll be here with buggy whips and stuff like that. So you need to let inefficient businesses die, even if this is painful. And you don't want to stop Amazon just because it's more efficient. On the other hand, you cannot ignore the risk that they might become a monopoly or have excessive market power.
That's interesting. On the labour front, I hadn't thought properly about that. But when you touched upon for a second marketplace there, that's actually quite similar to what we were talking about with Facebook earlier. Like Facebook spies on apps and buys them. Marketplace, they spy on what people are selling well, and then they copy them.
Absolutely. But to be honest, this takes place in every supermarket. Before Whole Foods was bought by Amazon, I used to shop at Whole Foods. I still shop at Whole Foods, but it's a brand, 365, that is the brand of Whole Foods, and what they do is they copy somebody else and put it at a lower price. So this is not unique, and at some point, if you have a lot of choices, you can choose not to sell at Whole Foods if they copy you. That's what competition is about. If you have a choice. The moment they become bigger, and then you don't have a choice, and then the importance of marketplace being independent and neutral becomes very important. That's, with Google, we know for a fact now they are the dominant. In fact, I was talking with people at Microsoft. I said, you have to tell me who used Bing, because in some statistics, Bing appear as having like 30% market share, and every time I do, who uses Bing here?
I know who uses Bing. No one else.
You say, no, it's two people.
A Microsoft attorney at the back of the room.
There was a deposition recently. It was the guy from Experian who he didn't Google, he Binged how much did other companies' stock go down when there was a cyber attack when he found out.
Do you know that because he announced that he was Binging? Because like, I'm Binging right now.
Because it was in the lawsuit.
But actually, what they told me, the secret is this: there is a correlation between Trump vote and use of Bing.
Oh, really?
And it's
so
very
but
it's very easy to explain, because Bing is used in the middle of the country, places where they ship the computer with Bing loaded. They don't change the default, and so that's their
competition is a click away, though. I thought people would fix it.
Yeah, Microsoft needs to come before Congress. Okay, we have lots of questions.
We have the Bing user there.
Why do you use Bing?
After I graduated Booth, I went out to New York and I worked in consulting, so I was working with white shoe firms. And then when Windows 95 came out, I ran out here, and I've been here ever since. So I've been an executive for multiple high-tech firms. I was just wondering, like, a lot of the antitrust issues, how much is related to unique culture issues here in the Valley? Because I've sat in a lot of board meetings with VCs and execs. I hear, for example, one thing is be number one or go home, right? Because of the network effect. Number two, better to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission. Those types of issues. How much does that exacerbate the antitrust issues and the anti-competitive behavior?
I think that at least the second one.
Let me actually ask that for the camera. Sorry, I forgot my word. Yeah, he was saying, how much does the culture of Silicon Valley exacerbate antitrust issues?
So the fact of asking for forgiveness rather than for permission, I think is pretty orthogonal to antitrust, because that has to do with breaking regulation, not necessarily antitrust. So I don't see that as necessarily related. The fact that be number one or die, General Electric used to have this, but that was a world in which there weren't so many network externalities, and where it was possible to have also number two and number three. They were divesting if they were not number one, but there was a number two and number three that made money. I think we are in a world in which this is increasingly difficult. Either you're number one and you make a ton of money, or if you're number two, you make no money. And that is the problem. I don't think it's just the culture. The culture may exacerbate, and what Jeremy was saying, the fact that Google is all over the place, it reminds, you all have seen It's a Wonderful Life and Potter, that in town control everything except the Bailey savings and loan. And then Yelp is basically the savings, Bailey and loan, fighting against the evil Potter.
But I think that that clearly makes it the antitrust problem more severe. That's definitely true.
A question from over here. Yeah, okay, on the left here. Yeah, my left, sorry.
Okay, dreaded two-part question. First one should be quick. How do you deal with self-selection bias at Yelp in particular? Some people, they're looking for karma. They're going to make ratings, ranks and ratings in just about every location, every place they go to. And then there's other people like myself that only when they have a bad experience or an exceptional experience, they provide their own opinion. How do you manage that? And that part two of the question is more along the lines of how do you value the data in and of itself? Is that possible? How do I value somebody who offers data all the time, doesn't care about who they give the data to, they're just freewheeling and they're just looking for getting good karma back, versus somebody who actually protects their data and is very valuable in that respect, but still doesn't give it up easily?
Okay, so that's an interesting question for you, Jeremy. It's about whether people who post a lot, whether their data is less valuable somehow. Yeah.
So I think the first part of the question was around the user base and the skew of reviews, positive versus negative. Is it all positive? Is it all negative? Is it somewhere in between? So the distribution overall skews positive, so it doesn't center perfectly on 3 stars, but it's not just 5 and 1. There's been some systems like YouTube, I think early on had a star system and abandoned it because people were either 1 or 5. We're actually pretty nicely distributed, but with a somewhat positive bias. And I think part of that is a lot of our contributors aren't just kind of one and done contributors. They join the community and tend to participate. We try to make it a fun experience for people that really want to engage. And actually, most of our users aren't contributors in the sense of writing reviews. Most of them are just the audience. Another way to think about us is like, CNN, a TV station, or someone that is broadcasting might have 200 people employed in creating the content, but then a very wide audience. And similarly, Yelp has a smaller subset that creates all the content, but then many millions that consume it. And the next question around data, how do we think about that value? I mean, certainly all of Yelp's value is from consumer data. Mostly not the nefarious secret kind where we're just collecting stuff on you and then selling that off or letting political people target you. It's mostly user volunteered data in the sense of you want to contribute a review and talk about your experience. That's incredibly valuable. And it actually, has economic impacts. So it allows other consumers in that particular locale to potentially spend more efficiently, go to more efficient businesses that provide better services. And so I think that's really that's really positive. How do you actually value that? There's a lot of ways that we try to go and look at that. How much traffic could a contribution potentially generate? Like some of those calculations go into how we think about spending on user acquisition. So when we go to Facebook and pay the toll to buy a new user that installs the app, part of our calculation is what do we think this person is going to be able to contribute, and how engaged are they going to be, as just an audience member, and the two become the equation that tells us how much to bid on installs, for example.
But sorry, on the ratings, you don't rescale. So if you see that somebody always give fantastic reviews versus somebody who is much more balanced, don't you rescale the ratings of the one that only fantastic reviews? Because not everything can be fantastic.
No, because it tends to come out in the wash. So it's, a popular place, especially here in San Francisco, might have 1,500 reviews. So one individual is not going to really move the needle all that much.
Because I have this problem when, for example, among faculty, we farm out, let's say, PhD applications to have ratings, and there are some that are always super positive and are always super negative.
Yeah.
So you need to rebalance in order to make things
right.
Okay.
You probably don't have a big enough sample size.
No, that's
in
exactly,
the ratings.
No,
we have a big sample.
That's the reason why I like your answer, because I think that.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go right to the back, because I don't want to neglect the people at the back.
I was wondering what your opinion is with respect to using decentralized ledger technology to address some of the issues with respect to market power and data portability.
So the question was, What's your opinion on using decentralized ledger technologies with respect to market power?
I think in principle sounds great. In practice, I fear it's not going to work. At least, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but all this huge hype for blockchain, I think that the part of blockchain that certainly is going to work is going to be not that decentralized, will be a common ledger that people use, but with some trusted parties that verify and decide what is legit and what is not legit. The fully decentralization requires somebody to mine or somebody, and it's fairly expensive to run. So I'm not so sure that this is going to be doable unless there is a significant innovation, because proof of stake is not sufficient because it's subject to attacks if you buy enough of that. So the mining is fairly reliable, but it's very expensive to run. And so I'm not so sure that this is, so the myth is a bit like internet 20 years ago. The dream of the internet is that we'll equalize, there will be better competition, blah, blah, blah. Now we're 20 years later and realize that it's not true, that actually the internet has created internet giants, that monopoly problems become worse, not better, and so on and so forth. And I fear that blockchain starts with the same phenomenal premises, and 20 years from now, maybe even 10, we're going to find out that it's not true.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. So if there's any women who are mulling something in their heads, then I will call on you next. But for now, I'll go to you. Yeah.
So my question is, are we worrying too much about the monopolies today? Because AOL disappeared over time, right? Right now, a lot more people, at least, in the US, are moving away from Facebook than onto it. Are we putting too much, like I go to Yelp directly when I want to look for a place to go. I don't go to Google. I go to Wikipedia for something. I go to specific, Stack Overflow for certain other things. So are we putting too much energy in thinking about what to do about these things when actually they might already have peaked?
So have some of these companies already peaked and we shouldn't worry about it?
I think it's a common view, especially at Chicago, that if you let things go long enough, eventually, problems will fix themselves. I think that I'm not as sort of convinced of this. I think it's useful to think about also for the innovation opportunities we're missing. So it's possible that somebody 50 years from now will find an alternative and will kill Google. But the question is how many innovations we have not gotten in the next 50 years as a result of that. So I think that the biggest point in favor of antitrust is this connection, as also Jeremy reminded us, between antitrust investigation and actual innovation. We always think that more monopoly will lead to more innovation. No. AT&T, when it was a big monopoly, was not particularly innovative, and all the improvements took place when you had competition. Think about the cab industry. It's not like the innovation of Uber is not that heart-shattering, and the incumbents could have done it fairly easily. It didn't take a sort of genius to do it. It's not like rocket science. Why did it not take place? Because it was a monopoly. I think that Hicks, a famous economist, said the biggest gift of a monopoly is a quiet life. And yes, you can live a very good life with a monopoly, not particularly innovative one.
Okay, any more questions? Yeah, the lady there.
If you were in charge of overhauling our antitrust system, what would you do?
So that was, if you were in charge of overhauling our antitrust system, what would you do?
I think that number one, I will force data portability in even social graph portability, making it mandatory. I would probably break up Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. Google, I will try to block Google from going into other businesses. So I think in the search, they are at this point a natural monopoly. I think it would be crazy to break that up because that would be have big efficiency consequences. But then you want to treat it as a natural monopoly that should not expand in other sort of contiguous business because we'll take advantage of that. And I will watch at the moment Amazon. I would not intervene on Amazon yet. I would just keep an eye. But you know, once you have done a couple of these things, you hit one and you educate 100. So I think that you don't need to do a lot to get an action.
I mean, you could break YouTube from Google. I don't see any reason why.
Yeah,
those have
I think
to be
you could. Yeah,
you know,
that's
search
true.
versus.
Good point. Yeah.
But for our particular case, we've actually built a site, focusontheuser.eu. Focus on the user is, I think it's a statement that comes from Google. That was part of their initial view on you know, how to build great things, and so we repurposed that in a website. And that lays out what we would do in our particular space for local.
Yeah, that's interesting. You have a video I was watching where you basically show that even if you use Google's own search engine, but you select only, you know, you select all the local sites, the local sites' results become higher than Google's own one. So it shows that they are themselves prioritizing.
So on this point, I want just to throw this as a thought for the night, because we are only discussed so far of the business aspect of this, which is very important. Even if I'm a business school professor, it's not the most important one. The most important one, of course, are the political consequences. So if Google rankings are so important to pick the business, what about their political rankings? So when we search about a candidate, are we getting an unbiased result or not? And I think that probably we do today, but it will take no time for Google to have a biased result. And what are the impacts of this on election? And sometimes you don't need to use that. It's just the threat of this is big enough.
That is a thought for them. Okay, well, I'll take 2 more questions before we finish up. Yeah, the gentleman now.
So whenever the FTC or the DOJ does an antitrust lawsuit, they normally look at the HHI, the criminal units, and they look at the 8 definitions and decide if that's good for competition or not. But you know, this was kind of designed and used to break the ball barriers, and this is like a 19th century invention. Do we even have the laws to go after Facebook and Google at this point? We would have to come up with a brand new set of laws for the 21st century.
Actually, the irony is that the initial laws are so vague that you can do anything you want.
So the question was, do we have the laws or do we need new laws to tackle?
No, I don't think we need new laws. The original laws are flexible enough. Ironically, what has constrained a lot the attitude of prosecutors and etc. has been a doctrine that was developed at Chicago in the 70s about the fact that you need to look only at consumer welfare in a very narrow and formalistic way. And I think that part needs to be updated, especially in light of two-sided markets, all this stuff. But that stuff does not require a new law. Requires all people to change their mind, which is sometimes more difficult than a new law, or that just them to be pushed away. And maybe that's a solution.
Pushed away. Okay. Is there, yeah, maybe that.
I was just wondering where you believe where capitalism ends and regulation begins. Where is that line exactly?
So the question is, where does capitalism end and regulation begin?
So the only Italian economist of the 20th century worth knowing is a guy called Luigi Zingales, who actually ended up being president of Italy. He was really a free marketeer, but he had this line that I love. He said one of the responsibility of the state is not only to enforce the law, but also to level the daily trenches that producers put behind themselves, hurting consumers. So I think that there is a part of the economic literature and also part of Chicago that thinks that markets are such a strong creatures that they form themselves and they arise, they form, and if you basically do laissez-faire, you get complete free markets. And I don't subscribe to that view. I think that you need to level the daily trenches in order to have a level playing field. And the big challenge is
who is going to do that job, because most of the time the person in charge of leveling the daily trenches spend too much time with the businesses who are protecting themselves with the trenches. So there is this, of course, huge conflict of interest. But, however, I think that we do need some rules, not only, of course, enforcement, but also, in essence, creating a level playing field. And I actually love, and I use now with my students, the story. I don't know if you're familiar with the Silk Road, not the Chinese Silk Road, but the one on the web that was selling stuff, illegal stuff. The Silk Road was founded by a guy who was a libertarian. And he thought that how cool in a world where you have a currency that is not backed by the government, where there is no law, anything is possible, is going to create a perfect marketplace. He ended up in jail because he actually paid somebody to kill somebody that was trying to blackmail him. So I think that's really is the death of the pure libertarian dream, that something can take place without any rule, without any superior authority. I think we need some form of rule, and the role of democracy is actually to keep the people setting those rules to act in the interest of us as people rather than in the interest of few producers. That's a real challenge.
I think that's a fantastic place to end it. Thank you both so much for joining us. If you have any more questions, I don't know if you can harass them on the way out, and hang around for drinks, but thank you so much.